Welcome, everybody. Delighted to host this hybrid event, both with people in the audience and those of you at home or in your office. I'm Victoria Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, and I want to welcome you to our discussion tonight. We are dedicated to one of our founders' visions of addressing the great issues of the day, as urged by the former president, Dickey, when he told us to see the world's problems as our problems, and to be part of understanding the challenges and what we can do about them, whether we're here at Dartmouth or out in the world. So I want to welcome you to the Obenshain Family Great Issues Lecture this evening. I want to thank Bill and Penny Obenshain for their great support. Not only are they great supporters of Dartmouth, but Bill is also the chair of the Dickey Center Board of Advisors and a real friend to the Dickey Center and to Dartmouth. The goal of this lecture is to animate discussion of a great issue, as I mentioned, part of hosting a distinguished visitor who we have with us today. And since 2016, when we started this series, we've had quite an array of people who spoke on a range of issues, including our own Professor Katie Power last year with Travis Atkins, who tackled the tough issue of how to build an anti-racist foreign policy. Earlier, we've had Alex Tier, who today runs the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and a few other people you may have heard of, Hillary Clinton, in conversation with Jake Sullivan, today the National Security Advisor, and also we've had Anthony Blinken, today the Secretary of State. So look out, Mike, I don't know what's next for you. So I'm very pleased that Mike Abramowitz has been able to join us today. He's here at Dartmouth for a number of visits and addressing the question of reversing the tide. Can we support democracy and counter-authoritarianism? Certainly, if we look at the news today of Russia's intervention in Ukraine, or the news very recently about China and the crackdown on the Uyghurs, we see in real time the challenge of authoritarianism. But it's not only that. There's been a rise in coups. There's been an erosion of democracy around the world, including here at home, which Mike will speak to in looking at the democracy equation that his center evaluates. So you really see the urgency of this issue, as well as changes in technological surveillance, increases on attacks on journalists and human rights defenders. So it's really worth asking the question that Mike will address today. I also want to note some surveys suggest that young people may even question democracy and ask if it is the best form of government. Others ask, what role can the U.S. play internationally when we have so much to do here at home in our own history and what we're seeing today? So those are also questions we ask when we look at the international system, which is based on the assumption of a rules-based rule of law system based on human rights. So who's our speaker today? I'm very pleased that Mike Abramowitz has joined us. He's the president of Freedom House, which is a non-partisan voice dedicated to promoting democracy. There he oversees a unique combination of analysis, advocacy, and direct support to frontline defenders for freedom, especially those working in closed authoritarian societies. He formerly directed the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, and before that, he led the museum's genocide prevention efforts. Many of us know him, however, from his long-term work at the Washington Post as a foremost journalist, both as a national editor and covering the White House. So it's certainly an interesting career that Mike has taken. So just for a note on process, because we are hybrid, Mike will give us remarks. I will join him in conversation, and then we'll open up to questions both here and from those of you watching. And so if you're interested in sending a question, Tom Candon will be monitoring this email, global.security@dartmouth.edu for your questions. And then certainly not last, I want to thank my Dartmouth colleagues, including my colleague Jason. We're very pleased that tonight the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy is co-hosting this, as is the Ethics Institute. Some really fine institutes here at Dartmouth. And so with that, Mike, the floor is yours.
Do you want me here or there?
Why don't you come up here?
Okay. Thank you, Tori. It's a real pleasure to be here at Dartmouth, and I want to thank you personally. Tori and I got to know each other maybe 9 or 10 years ago when I worked at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we worked on what I still think is one of the most significant private commissions that has been involved in Washington. You know, typically commission reports kind of issued by think tanks sit on shelves, kind of ignored by policymakers. But the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which Tori was one of the expert advisors to, and my museum, the museum, put out, was really one of the more significant policy papers. That's something we might want to talk a little bit about. So thank you for having me here. I will say I'm also good friends with her predecessor, Dan, who never invited me here. So Tori, it's just the first year here, you got me here. So I'll make sure Dan knows about that. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. What I'd like to do is really tell you a little bit about the problem we're working on at Freedom House. And I'd also like to tell you a little bit about what Freedom House does to tackle the problem. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes and then I'd like to have a real dialogue with this group and the online group. One of the most important messages that I think I would like to leave today is that democracy is in real trouble. It's in real trouble around the world, and it's in real trouble in our country, sadly. And if there's one thing I'd like you to leave the talk today, it's just with that simple idea. Freedom House has been working on this problem for more than 80 years. We were founded in 1941, and I'll give you a bit of the history because I think it's relevant. We were founded essentially as an organization that was dedicated to trying to get the United States into the war against fascism. It was founded before Pearl Harbor, and at the time, there was an America First movement, actually, which many people today conveniently forget, but it was a movement that was really quite isolationist, wanted to keep America out of the war in Europe, and really was very inward-looking. 90% of Americans at the time thought that we should not get involved in what became World War II. But Freedom House was brought together by a group of internationalists that were largely allied with the Roosevelt administration, but there were others. Among the founders of Freedom House were Eleanor Roosevelt and also Wendell Willkie, who had run against Eleanor in 1940 for president. And I still am very inspired by that founding story because think about it today, having the first lady and the person who ran against her husband, it was unthinkable today in our world. But that was Freedom House. And I think over the years of Freedom House's history, we have been able to attract people across the political spectrum who are dedicated to the principles that Freedom House stands on: free and fair elections, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all the core indicators that we look at in Freedom in the World, which, as Tori alluded to, is our core product. So we have actually been measuring the health of democracy for close to 50 years. We actually started this project in 1973, and it was a time when democracy was kind of on its back foot, actually. It was a time where there was a Soviet bloc, there was dictatorships all across Latin America, dictatorships in Africa. There were several dozen democracies in the world, I'm guessing, at the time. And we created Freedom of the World, or my predecessors created Freedom of the World, as a way of focusing attention on this problem. And we have now become, through this report, kind of the Michelin Guide of countries. The basic story of Freedom in the World is that for the first 2/3 of that history, democracy actually grew, punctuated by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, but also the collapse of dictatorships around the world. And at some point in that first 35 years, democracy overtook autocracy as kind of the leading form of government in the world. We are now in the middle, and I hope the end, but we are in the midst of a democracy recession. So every year for the last 15 years, more countries have experienced declines in their political rights, declines in their civil liberties. These are the things that we measure in Freedom of the World, than those having improvements. And this is happening all over the world. It's happening in every continent. The first part of this democratic recession, which has lasted about 15 years, really saw authoritarian countries getting even more authoritarian. So think like what's happened in Russia or China. I think the disturbing thing in the last 5 years is that we've been joined by democracies weakening. Countries like India, also the United States, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So we're in the midst of this democracy recession, and at Freedom House, we're dedicated to trying to turn that around. For those of you who know our report, we have a map of the world, and the green countries are the free countries, the yellow countries are the partly free countries, and the purple countries are the unfree countries. And what we've seen is really a gradual push of the world's population into unfree countries and to partly free countries. I believe close to the statistic, I'll give you a little sneak preview of our report that's coming out officially in 2 days, but only 1 in 5 people in the world now live in a free country, which is a country that has rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, free and fair elections. I mean, that's a really sobering statistic. It's eye-popping to me. So we want to turn that around. Final point about Freedom House before I stop and talk is that we are a do tank in addition to being a think tank. So we're known for our research products, Freedom of the World, also Freedom of the Net. For those of you who care about the growing erosions of online rights, you should look at Freedom of the Net. That's a really great report. But we also want to do something about it. And we really pursue this in 2 ways. One, we are an advocacy organization. And one of my goals at Freedom House is to really build up our advocacy function and really push countries to be more supportive of human rights, more supportive of democracy. It's a very hard sell today in this kind of realistic world. But I would say that it is something that we need to redouble our efforts at. If you think about the events in Ukraine today, that is being looked at as primarily like a geopolitical story. But to me, it's also a freedom story, because the Ukraine is a democracy, a flawed democracy perhaps, but a democracy nonetheless. And over the last 20 to 25 years, the people of Ukraine have made it very clear that they want to remain a democracy. And if President Putin goes in, as he's been threatening, and even goes all the way to Kiev, that is really going to be a problem for democracy and something that we are deeply concerned about at Freedom House. The other thing we do at Freedom House, which I'm tremendously proud of, is the work we do to support human rights defenders who are working on the ground in places all over the world struggling for freedom. So we are on the ground, well, we're not on the ground physically, but we are supporting human rights defenders in more than 140 countries or so. We operate programs of emergency assistance, so if human rights defenders are in need of legal help, if they're in need of security, we help them at Freedom House. And so we can't tell people in countries like Belarus or Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania, Myanmar, like what to do, but we can support them in their struggle to be free. So that's something we could also talk about today. So I'm just going to stop there. I'm tremendously pleased to be here, and I'm tremendously proud about the work we do at Freedom House. Our aspiration is to turn that map green, but that's probably not going to happen, sadly, in my lifetime. But I will stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We'll give you a moment to get settled. When you say the word green, people at Dartmouth pay attention.
Okay.
So,
That's right.
that's right. Well, thanks very much. So you mentioned a big report's coming out later this week, but let's back up a little bit. Some of these statistics sort of roll off your tongue, and I think that it would be worth unpacking them a bit. So this erosion of democracy, can you tell us about what the trends have been, say, for the last 5 or 10, 15 years? A few things you've mentioned. There's been an increase in coups. You know, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Sudan, Mali. Is that part of the trend line you're seeing? Also, traditional, well-known democracies have also seen an erosion in their own standing, in your scale and others' views of democracy today. Can you tell us what's going on, what these broad trends may be pointing to?
Right. Well, the big trend is declining respect for political rights and civil liberties full stop. So what you found, as I indicated in my talk, there are fewer and fewer countries that are seeing improvements in their respect for political rights and civil liberties. I start with China and Russia because I think they are kind of the leading edge of the authoritarian surge. So both countries, in their own idiosyncratic ways, have really moved decisively towards a more repressive approach over the last, say, 20 to 30 years. When Vladimir Putin took office in Russia in 2000, Russia was actually a partly free country. It was a kind of a struggling democracy, but there was a lively civil society, a somewhat free press, and that was basically all extinguished within a number of years by Putin. And by the way, Putin, I think, we did an interesting report 3 or 4 years ago about this, was kind of a trendsetter, and other authoritarian-minded leaders around the world, I think, took a look at how we handled things and figured out that you can do a lot to hold on to power without necessarily killing people. The other leading edge of the authoritarian kind of resurgence is obviously China. And again, China, when I actually went with President Bush as part of the White House press corps to the Olympics in 2008. When that was my last year, I was a reporter. And there really wasn't much debate about President Bush going to the Olympics. I think people saw China as liberalizing, and it was something that he thought was going to kind of help support the forces of liberalization. And of course, I think that judgment, while well-intentioned, turned out to be wrong because President Xi took office. And I think, again, one of the most eye-popping statistics from our report is that China, from a very low base 8 or 9 years ago, I think when President Xi took office, we rated China 17, gave 17 points on the scale of 0 to 100, and it's now down to 9. So that is really a low score in the Freedom House Index. So again, what's interesting about both China and Russia is that both countries have now moved to extend their efforts to repress beyond their borders. We did a report, I think it was one of the most significant reports that we did at Freedom House on the trend we called transnational repression, which was the practice of authoritarian powers targeting their dissidents beyond their borders. And think, for instance, about what happened with Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey several years ago. We did a very detailed report about many cases of this. Murders happen, but also just intimidation, the Chinese intimidating Uyghur families in the diaspora to kind of shut up. So that there's just a really concerted effort by authoritarian countries to do that. So I think that is one major trend of the last several years, of the last 20, 25 years. It's not the only one. We can talk about other factors, but that's something, by the way, that we will be focusing on in our report coming out on Thursday.
Well, Freedom House, you've highlighted one of their major reports, but the website is very difficult to get through since there's so much data involved. But one that really I thought was impressive was a task force you put together, and I'd love you to talk about it. That looked at basically the title of this talk, Reversing the Tide, and it linked both international democracy to U.S. interests and values, as well as the challenges here at home. And it laid out 7 broad areas of strategy, dealing with everything from corruption and misinformation to the democratic states around the world being more fragile, the abuse that we've mentioned towards human rights defenders, and needing to elevate voices of universities, youth, women, among other things. It called for some fairly extensive U.S. government goals, including making the most of the Democracy Summit, having democracy be part of a national security strategy. So it's huge, but maybe you could speak to this audience a bit about both what motivated you and your colleagues to put the task force together, if you have some priorities coming out of it.
Sure. Well, what motivated us was something pretty simple, that we saw the trends that I've identified. These have been, it's kind of depressing. The Freedom House reports tend to be kind of, there's always something different every year, but the directional element of these reports are very clear. And we wanted to not just diagnose the problem, but try to make some recommendations to government about what to do about the problem. So we put together, we actually approached CSIS, a very prominent think tank in Washington, plus the McCain Institute, which has a very kind of pro-democracy orientation that one would associate with John McCain. And we decided to basically try to write a strategy for what the US government should do to really elevate defense of democracy to a more central point in its foreign policy. And it was really directed at the US government. And I would say there are a lot of reports that are very good that look at different dimensions of this, but I think there hasn't really been an effort to kind of take a holistic view and say, here's what the strategy of a new administration should be. And by the way, we wrote this before the election in 2020, and it was going to be directed. We would have pushed the recommendations whether Trump or Biden had been elected. But I think Biden came into office, I think, very much, I think, sympathetic to the central theme of the report, which is that really the issue of countering authoritarianism and supporting democracy should be at the center of US foreign policy. And I think a lot of his rhetoric in the early days, his inaugural speech, some of the early guidance around national security reflect this. I think, sadly, the reality of being in office, I think, has made things a little bit more like a traditional administration where, you know, you're balancing different things off with democracy. I mean, we're still hopeful it's only 1 year in, but they've got a lot of issues on their plate right now.
Yeah. Well, probably every task force in DC says their issues should be the center of the universe. That's always a challenge, right?
Yeah.
But it seemed the task force also took some innovative approaches. You tried to highlight the role of corruption, for example,
Right.
and technology change. Can you tell us why those were things that the task force would put a focus on in the context of democracy?
Right. I think our task force tried to put a spotlight on elements of what could be a democracy policy. I mean, when you talk about democracy, first of all, I was talking with some of your colleagues earlier today, democracy is a hard sell for people. But, you know, fighting corruption, which was a major part of our task force, had a lot of ideas, specific ideas in there for like what the government should do to combat corruption, which is, if you look at the Freedom House report, and if you look at you know, what's happening around the world, that's a major challenge that I think, I'm not sure I could defend this totally from an academic point of view, but I do believe that corruption is like a leading indicator of more democratic problems. I mean, it's not, I mean, that was evident early on in the Putin years, and I think that, so I think tackling corruption, that's been something that the Biden administration has actually picked up as one of the things. I mean, I think the other issue, which is really such a huge issue, and there's, again, no silver bullet for this, but this is, you know, the growing use of technology for ill, if you will. So we all thought that the internet, all the new technologies were going to be positives for human rights and democracy, but I think it's been kind of negative over the last number of years. And so the ability of bad actors to basically exploit kind of the openness of the internet, to spread disinformation, to you know, intimidate people through online mobs, I think that's really a big problem. And so I think our report had some ideas for how to tackle that. The administration, at the end of 2021, had a democracy summit. That was actually one of the few things, that was one of the few foreign policy promises that President Biden made during the campaign, that he would have a summit for democracy. And, you know, there was some debate about whether that was a good idea, who was to be invited, but I think as a way of putting this issue on the table, I think it was reasonable because of COVID. And by the way, COVID is another factor that's we found in our reports that has eroded democracy because, but we can come back to that. But the summit was supposed to be in person. They couldn't do that because of COVID, so they had a virtual summit, which probably left a lot to be desired. They're now planning a follow-up and they've asked every country to make commitments of things that they would do to try to strengthen democracy. And so I think our job, others in civil society, global society, is to try to hold governments to account, to actually see if they deliver on those pledges.
Yeah, well, that's good. So 2 questions, and then I'll open up to the audience. What do you say to Americans who are skeptical? You say democracy is a hard sell. You know, it's been used for all sorts of purposes internationally, and there are many who fear that our country was founded not on a democratic principle at all. Those have always been ideals we strive to, but we're not there yet. So how do you speak to them about the importance of democracy here at home?
Well, the general point I make, first of all, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for people who care about democracy and care about freedom, really making the case that this is something that's worth putting a lot of effort into. I mean, I do happen to believe that from a freedom point of view, from an ability to speak freely, to think freely, to have freedom of conscience, you know, democracy is the way to go. I mean, no one wants to live who has a choice in an authoritarian setting. I think we have to be able to make also a stronger case in some ways of the kind of instrumental values of democracy, that democracies, I think it's pretty strong in the academic literature that democracies don't declare war on one another, go to war with another. I think, you know, we also have to make the case that in the long term, the business environment is going to be better with democracy. I do think that, I have to think that a lot of American businesses are rethinking their thoughts about China, given some of what's been coming out of China in the last couple of years. I do think that one other case that I would make is that strengthening democracy is crucial to our ability to address issues that we want to address, whether it's climate change, immigration. If you look at our own country, you know, we have a very disjointed, polarized, gridlocked democracy. If we had a more functioning democracy, then we could address some of the problems that we really care about and that young people in particular are justifiably concerned about. So I do think that we have to make a stronger case for democracy as just crucial to our well-being.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I will also note something you and I mentioned to you earlier, was that there was a RAND study in 2017 that was trying to advise the incoming administration, at the time it was the Trump administration, on how to prevent the necessary use of military force, how to avoid war. And it said there's roughly 9 to 11 indicators. But the 3 most important is US leadership in the world, strong international organizations, and continued democracies around the world. So obviously the last one is somewhat decayed. The task force you put together makes a strong case that our international standing in the world and our advocacy for democracy is part of what will make us more safe and secure. And I know you've also worked around international institutions and argued that point. Is there anything more you might want to say to us about that link?
Well, I would very strongly associate my thinking with the view that the strength of global democracy is really linked to strong US democracy. I think, you know, if you think about what happened on January 6, 2021, those events were watched closely by friends and foe alike. It was a propaganda victory for authoritarian mind who said, look, what's happening in America, who are they to lecture you? And I think our friends were I think, disheartened. The US friends were disheartened by what happened here, there's no question. So I don't want to be naive about the United States. We've made very serious mistakes across a variety of issues, whether it's the Iraq War, slavery. You know, there's a lot of things that we can't be proud of. But I do think that we are a country that aspires, and it's in our founding documents, you know, to be constantly improving. And so I do have hope, because I think that unless we try to resume that trajectory, it will be very difficult for us to combat this global trend that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Well, thanks so much. Let me open up to the audience here. We've got people both here with us physically. We also have some of you who've been sending in some questions. So let me start first with, I'll look to the questions that have come in, and then if you'd like to speak and you're in the room, just kind of wave at me and I will call But let me turn to my colleague, Tom Candon. Do you have any questions for us?
We do have a couple, and I'll go through them. The first one is actually questioning one of the country's freedom score, and that is, why is Brazil green on the Freedom House scoring?
Brazil has been declining in recent years. Why it's green and not yet yellow, I think I'm not going to answer that specific, except to say that our scores are very much put together in a very rigorous manner. We look at 24 different indicators of political rights and civil liberties. These are cross-checked. We consult with a lot of experts in country and around the world. We make sure that the scores are, seem reasonable compared to like countries. And so all I can say about Brazil is that I think you can take those scores to the bank. We get constant criticism for our scores. I don't mean it like the scores are bad, but like when you are rating a country, if you rate a country poorly or rate them well, someone's always going to be, unhappy about it. But I think that we really try to get the scores right. And there are, regrettably, some competitors to Freedom House. I don't know why there would be a need for other democracy indicators, but I think our scores correlate pretty well with, some of the other more academic, like VDEM or The Economist intelligence unit. So, long-winded answer of saying I'm comfortable with our scores there.
Very good. I think we're going to go to the room now. I see John Kerry. Do you want to? Hang on, there's a microphone headed your way. There we go.
Sorry. I won't yell quite as much. I want to ask you to talk about, you started off talking about the sort of sweep of history and how democracy's changed around the world and this current recession. So I've been teaching classes on comparative politics for decades now, and one of the things that we always taught, at least until recently, is that the richer countries are, the more likely they are to be democratic. As the world generally gets richer over time, it generally got more democratic, at least for a long time. And we might add a corollary to that, say, well, as long as you don't get rich by selling oil, then the richer you are, the more democratic you're going to be. But by and large, that stood up pretty well, I think, for a long time. When we think about this latest recession, has that relationship disconnected? And if it has, I'm just kind of curious if you can speculate a little bit about why that might be the case.
It's a great question, and a humble, honest answer, John, is I'm not sure the answer to your question. But what I will say, I think that China in particular offers a cautionary story for us, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about it, but let's just say that there was a conventional wisdom about China that as China grew richer, developed a middle class, sent students to the West to study, opened itself up, joined the World Trade Organization, as it moved more to being like a mainly middle class country as opposed to a predominantly poor country, that would result in more openness. That has not happened, clearly, because China, at least according to our scores, and many others, has moved in the wrong direction. I can speculate. I do think that the ability of China to kind of marshal technology and the internet to basically surveil, to invade privacy, to prevent people from accessing information they want is pretty strong right now. Maybe that has something to do with it. But I do think that China presents a challenge to us because it's the one country that seems to say that you could have strong economic growth and thriving maybe not capitalism, but mercantilism of some sort without allowing rights. I happen to believe that in the long term that's not going to work, but it's a challenge to us now, and I think that's something we have to really think about carefully.
Thanks. Tom, we'll turn to you again, and then we'll come back to the room after that.
Okay, we have a question from one of our students, class of 25, who says, thank you for hosting this interesting talk. My question is, how can the U.S. support democratic reforms, including electoral legitimacy, anti-corruption, and decentralization in Ukraine when Russia places such an emphasis on maintaining unilateral influence in the region and views Western support and soft power as a dangerous infringement on its sphere of influence?
It's a great question. I think what the question to me points to is that right now we have to be relatively humble and restrained about making claims for, what we can do. I mean, Ukraine is right there in the Russian neighborhood, and obviously Russia has a great deal of influence and sadly may have more hard power influence in the next couple weeks than we had hoped. I do think that this is one reason, I guess a couple things I would say. Number one, I think it's one reason why I think it's really important for the United States to model strong democratic behavior. I think that gives us more credibility to tackle this. I think secondly, it's a reason why we should not give up on trying to support democracy overseas. I think there's a lot of evidence in recent years about kind of the limits of military interventions. But I would say one thing about the report that you referenced, Tori, is that none of the recommendations there had anything to do with invasion or military intervention. It was all about the use of soft power, the use of certain types of diplomatic measures, of sanctions, of really non-kinetic efforts. And I think it's not going to be one cookie-cutter answer for each country, but I think there are things that we can do. And I would say one important thing we can do is really to support human rights defenders, because the people who are, I think, the most well-positioned to help are the people on the ground in these countries. I'm very struck, I was talking in one of the classes today about Sudan. Sudan is a country that I've tracked for a while. I would not say I'm an expert on Sudan, but when I was at the Holocaust Museum, we were very interested in Sudan because of the genocide that took place in Darfur. And I think Sudan had been kind of written off by the democracy community. Bashir, the then president, had been guilty, had been accused of genocide. No one ever thought that he might be on his way to go to the ICC. And yet, the people of Sudan themselves, there was a grassroots revolution there. And I think that was interesting to me, that said that our job is to try to figure out how to support some of these grassroots movements, because they're the ones that are going to be having democratic change, I think, in the future.
I'm just curious, you mentioned that Freedom House operates by supporting local actors.
Mm-hmm.
Is Ukraine one of those countries where Freedom House has operated?
Yes.
And today as well?
Well, the issue that we've worked on in Ukraine is extremism and helping civil society in Ukraine deal with extremism. And that's been I think we've had some success there, but I mean, I think today there are bigger issues than that.
Okay, very good. All right. I tell you what, I see a lot of hands going up. I had a couple folks written down first. Let's do Bill, and then Ezzedine, and then I see some other hands.
Thank you so much. Really thought-provoking and concerning remarks that you've made. I just would like to know a little bit more about the baskets of activity that Freedom House is involved in. It's so interesting that we all see the maps and we see the reports, but your opening remark concerned 70 years ago, sort of working to make America take a stand on fighting totalitarianism, in the 1940s. And I guess the question is, of the activities that you are involved in your mission to protect and expand democracy or freedom in the world, how much of it is directed inward at the United States? In particular at like what might be called lobbying or trying to influence public opinion. I ask that question because we are seeing, or at least widely reported, is a shift, at least in one of the parties, but I think both of the parties in the United States, where there are factions or wings within each of these parties that are moving decisively away from the idea of American internationalism, American mission, American exceptionalism, that America has any real responsibility in the world beyond its narrow material self-interest as a country. And so I'm just wondering, is part of your mission to work within these parties, to get involved in the intra-party conversation about America's interest in the world, or is it more this, the map and then the external helping, assisting human rights activists and working on the ground in the kind of countries that you just mentioned?
Right. It's a great question, and thank you for that, because I do think that the question of what Freedom House should be doing about the clear erosion of U.S. democracy over the last 11 or 12 years is something that I think about a lot. I always start by saying that the most important thing we can do is offering a credible, objective assessment of U.S. democracy. I think that's actually something that's important. We analyze the United States the same way as we look at Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, China, wherever. We have the same indicators, and when we strive very hard to make objective assessments. And I actually think that that's important for our credibility. So for instance, last year, the big story last year in our report was actually India. India has had a lot of democratic erosion as well, as some of you know, and India last year crossed from being a free country to a partly free country, and actually got a lot of attention in India, had a lot of criticism from the Indian government, allies of the Indian government saying, who the hell are you guys to say this? You're just a Western organization, why should we? And I mean, that may be resonant, but at least I had the ability to say to people, no. By the way, we've actually criticized our country too. And so we are trying to look at this objectively. So I always start with that. I would also say I do think that Freedom House has an important role to play in looking at the global situation and trying to put the United States in some context for what's happening here. Honestly, there are lots of organizations that do a great job on specific issues like money in politics or fighting gerrymandering. We're not gonna, we don't have a huge advocacy team. Like, I think it'll be a waste of resources for us. I mean, we can support this in our, like as our advocacy messages, but I think where we can play more of a role is in able to kind of point to other countries and say, look, if we continue to go in this direction, this is what things might look like. And so I'd like to do more of that at Freedom House. And I would like to also use our reports, our approach to democracy to kind of educate Americans, college students, businesses, media about some of the threats to democracy. I think that's the role that Freedom House can play. So I think we cannot turn our head away from US democracy, but I also think we have to kind of try to stay in our lane of what we're experts in, or what we're good at, and not just do other things. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thanks, really interesting. Let's turn now to Ezzedine, and then I see some additional hands.
Thank you. I teach Middle East politics, so you can probably see where my question is.
Okay.
The White House Middle East coordinator, Brett McGurk, just about 3 weeks ago, had a conversation with Aaron David Miller. It's on Carnegie, and a very interesting one. And Miller asked him about the place of democracy and human rights in the Middle East in the relationship under the Biden administration. And McGurk was pretty straightforward. It's in the conversation. We talk about these issues, but our main interests are elsewhere. The focus is elsewhere. And as Miller said, it would be nice if they cooperate on these issues, but this is not where the game is. What do you say, and not just as president of Freedom House, but also as former White House hand, what are the tangible things that you have to say to the Biden administration as to why that's not such a great approach to democracy?
It's a great question. First of all, Aaron David Miller is a very good friend of mine. He and I have coffee like every other week, and we fight about democracy because he tells me sort of what he said in the interview he had with Brett McGurk. I think what I would say, sir, is that, first of all, I do think that democracy is not just a Western construct. I mean, I'm struck around the world where democracy has taken root in places where people said it could never. And by the way, it's struggling now, for instance, in Tunisia. But that's right there in the Middle East. And there was a setback last year, but that's still a democracy there. Taiwan, 30 or 40 years ago, it's kind of an incredible story. It was a dictatorship, and now it's really one of the strongest democracies in the world. So I do believe in my heart that it can take place anywhere. I would also say that, number two, I would say the issue of balancing interests and values that's been part of US foreign policy going back for generations. And I'm going to always be fighting for a stronger line on human rights and democracy, but there are going to be cases where someone sitting at the National Security Council is going to look differently at this. But I will say that I do think in the long term, our values are our interests, right? I do think that if we are, you can always find a reason that a specific country, not to press a certain country. But in the long term, if Egypt continually represses its people and throws people in jail, if Saudi Arabia denies rights to half its citizens, I just don't think that's tenable in the long term. And I think we want to be associated as a country with a place that at least tried to support the people struggling for their rights. It's not a great answer, and I think it's always challenging, but I think that's how I think about it.
All right. There's a young woman over here, and then I'll turn to Charlie.
Thank you. A lot of people contribute the rise of populism in the US and throughout Europe due to increasing bureaucracy, an increasingly technocratic government, and some kind of alienation of certain voices and certain groups. I was wondering if you think this is a fixable problem in the US and throughout Europe, and if so, what should we do about it?
It's a great question. Let me just start by maybe making a provocative, maybe not such a provocative assumption, but populism is not necessarily a bad thing all the time. I think that that's the nature of democracy. If the people in power are not delivering, and the people have a different way of doing things, then it's right. I think the problem comes in when populists, whether it's in Venezuela, kind of a left-wing form of populism, or in Hungary, more of a right-wing form of populism, when people kind of seek to kind of solidify their power and stay in power in perpetuity by using these populists. So I think, I just want to distinguish that I think that populism can be a natural way of refreshing democracy. I don't have a great answer of what to do about it. I certainly think in our country, I'm continually struck by the problems of the media and the media ecosystem here. When I was a reporter at the Washington Post, when I started in the mid-'80s, there were problems. I wouldn't say it's not like the good old days, but there was more appreciation or respect for basic facts. You weren't like arguing about, you know, whether the election was stolen or not based on completely, you know, made up claims. And so I do think that trying to restore some trust in the media is kind of an important thing. I think that plays a big role in these things, and I hope that the fever will break at some point. I don't have a great answer for how to do that.
Thanks very much. Charlie.
Thank you. Could you talk just a little bit more about balancing the relationship with China, our concerns about human rights violations, but also the need to work with China on North Korea, climate change, trying to keep China from forming a bloc with Russia? How do you negotiate that particular set of clashes?
Honestly, sir, it's a great question. There's not a silver bullet to that. I think that we have to work with China on climate change, obviously. We have to work on addressing nuclear nonproliferation, but we also have to stand up for our values. We have to call it out. I mean, genocide in Xinjiang, there's a very credible case that I believe has been made. The Holocaust Museum issued a very strong report on this a few months ago. I think the answer is not to pull back from these claims. And I think a particularly worrisome trend, I think, that I see is American institutions, universities, businesses, the NBA, you know, basically allowing themselves to be intimidated. I think everybody needs to kind of recognize that they should be able to say what they want in this country, and they need to be backed up by the government. So that's sort of how I see it. It's not a perfect answer to that, but I think a wholesale retreat from our values would, I think, not be the way to go.
All right, thanks. I'm going to go to Tom, and then I've seen at least 4 other hands in the room that I'll turn to next.
Sure. We've got another question from another member of our class of 25, and this actually references a section in your Freedom House report, which is, can you expand on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on democracy around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the COVID-19 has been obviously a big healthcare problem, a big economic problem, but it's also been a human rights and democracy problem around the world. And what you've seen in essentially the big trend that we've seen in our reports and studies is that countries are kind of using the pandemic as a pretext to enact legislation that's not really commensurate with the challenge. I mean, we all recognize that there may be some things that need to be done to protect public health, but, you know, Viktor Orban didn't need special emergency powers. You know, that was kind of a little bit of a power grab on his part. And I think, you know, there's been a lot more tracking and surveillance of people in the name of public health. Again, I get that, but will that remain when the pandemic goes away? I think so we're very worried about, I think there's no question to me that some of the erosion of democracy that we've seen over the last 2 years has been linked, at least in part, to the pandemic.
All right. So I'm going to turn to a student over here, Caleb, and then Barbara, you'll be next.
My question concerns non-state actors. And I think we saw a pretty dramatic shift, especially in the early 2010s, possibly even earlier, of terrorist groups in the Middle East and North Africa having more territorial ambitions. And I was just wondering about, you know, what you thought that effect, the change from having, you know, wanting to attack me in the United States to having territorial ambitions has had on democracies in the region and anti-democratic change, especially, you know, in the context of recent coups in Mali and Burkina Faso.
You know, it's a good question. I'm not going to have a totally satisfactory answer, Caleb, but let me just say one thing. I think one thing that's important to note about Freedom House's report is that it's not a measurement it's not a rating of governments. It's a rating of the level of freedom that's enjoyed or not enjoyed by the people in a particular country, or in some cases, a particular territory. So state actors and non-state actors can contribute to either freedom or a lack of freedom. I'm trying, but I'm kind of grasping for a good example of what I'm talking about, but certainly, you know, in Crimea would be an example. You know, the Ukraine government does not really have full control over, so we rate Crimea differently than we do the rest of Ukraine. And that shows the influence of some of the non-state actors. So I think it's an issue that we grapple with. That's what I would say.
Just to add to that, is there any way that Freedom House looks at places that do experience coups or democratic reversals as part of a process? Because you've cited a few places, which, like Sudan, which were quite authoritarian. There's a change of government there. Like, is this anything that you look at as kind of like a process of democracy, or is that beyond what you analyze?
Well, I certainly think that there was a proliferation of coups in 2021. I believe there were probably more coups in 2021 than I think in any of the previous 10 years. So it's part of democracy in the sense that many countries are in like a fitful journey along this. I mean, think about Myanmar, right? It was kind of a military dictatorship for a long time. 2011, there was an opening. It continued for a while. Then there was a coup in early 2021. So it's kind of forward a little, backwards. And
Yeah. Or
so
Mali, where we've seen
in
two
Mali,
coups.
there were 2 coups, I think, in Mali in the last
Yeah.
12 months. And obviously, effectively coups in Sudan and Tunisia, although not labeled coups as such. You know, the Taliban, not necessarily a coup, but certainly the end of a democratic experiment there. So I think one thing that's interesting about these cases, and I probably can't prove this scientifically, but I do feel that military leaders are probably emboldened by an expectation that they will not pay a huge penalty for staging a coup. The leaders of Myanmar know that they are going to continue to get support from the Chinese government. Now maybe even the Russian government as well. So there's not a deterrent effect by the I don't think the United States has even declared a coup in Sudan, by the way, even though it clearly, I think by many definitions it would be. Yeah. So that's another thing I think about with respect to coups.
That's really interesting. All right, Barbara, you're next.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. I keep thinking about the phrase Tori picked up on, that people can't really get behind democracy somehow, that there's something about it that's a little opaque, or especially if you're not in this world of talking about it. And I was thinking about that in terms of language. So do you think it's possible that what we're seeing is the terms that would be used to help us understand a concept like democracy, and here I'm thinking of the term freedom, are being co-opted by people who have authoritarian tendencies? And the example would be the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, which was a democratic protest, but it turned out that there was actually this background of kind of, authoritarian, shadowy right-wing authoritarian groups that were also involved. It's a very murky moment, but I feel like that's the house of mirrors we've been living in for the last 5 or 10 years. Is sort of the term, even the terms that we take as essential to being able to define these things suddenly are being used in ways that seem antithetical to what we thought. Do you know what I mean? So I'm finding that a really hard thing to sort of grapple with in my mind, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, the thing that comes to mind from your question is the statement that was put out by President Xi and President Putin on the eve of the Olympics. So remember, Putin went to China. I'm sorry, the other way. Yeah, Putin went to China to meet with Xi Jinping and kind of like the leaders of the autocratic club. And I would highly commend to this group to read the joint statement that they put out. Because essentially what they said is, we're democracies. We just define it a little bit differently than you. And so, of course, that's farcical. By no definition that we would use a democracy does China or Russia meet a democracy. But I do think, number one, in some ways, it's kind of heartening that they feel like they have to couch themselves as a democracy. So, but I think the more disturbing thing is this kind of contestation for the name. I happen to think that freedom is a better word, more powerful word than democracy. I think we're Freedom House, we're not Democracy House. And I think that was chosen for a reason, even though like the issue we work on is democracy. So that's sort of a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
All right, I see the woman in the back.
Is a hard sell. How do you have democracies, especially in this country, when truth is completely confused with opinion, and social media encourages that? So how do you get to a place where somehow democracies are normally built on truth? How do you get back to a place where somehow truth rules?
I wish I knew the answer. I wish I knew the answer. I honestly, as I said a couple minutes ago, I think it's one of the gravest challenges that's facing democracy is the ability to kind of agree on a common set of facts. So I worry about that. I think we just have to keep trying, but I think that's one of the big challenges that we face. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you or a more hopeful answer to you, but I worry about that all the time.
Your task force did suggest there'd be like an enterprise fund for independent media, for example. And I know one of the challenges you put on the table for universities is to think about the current means of communication and technology and how those can stay sort of truth-based, small d democracy. So I don't think you told us you had answers to those.
Well, one thing I would say,
but you
Tori,
did argue they were
one
problems.
thing actually you reminded me to say, one thing you reminded me of is I do think that when you break down democracy into its component parts, I think it does become an easier sell. I think people do believe in truth, but I think people do believe in, transparency, not having a corrupt system, having, a strong media. I think.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting. Like when I see polling, and by the way, you have better experts on polling in this group, but I sense that there's actually a lot of agreement across the political aisle about some of the problems that afflict democracy. It's just hard to get people to agree on what to do about it.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Jason in a second, but I'm just going to mention something that's striking to me is, I've worked around UN peacekeeping issues in the Security Council. And in the 90s, a lot of the missions were failing. And the realization was if you just have a peace agreement and you just have security forces, it's not enough. You need to be able to hand off governance, rule of law, accountability, transparency, and human rights as part of a new government that people would trust, or else it would cycle back to conflict. And interestingly, the Security Council, with full support from China, from Russia, from often elected members who are not themselves necessarily democracies, would vote for these missions with long 10-page resolutions calling for rule of law, human rights, transparency. And so it was a security enterprise, but those were the building blocks that would make it stable and long-lasting. So earlier you mentioned some of this is about soft power, but I would argue those are also elements that avoid having to use more hard power, and there's nothing sort of soft about it in the sense of this is what we discovered coming into the 2000s and since was necessary for countries not to go back to conflict. So just as a corollary, both Russia and China continue to vote for those resolutions to some degree, even if they may not enterprise that at home. Jason, over to you.
Thank you. So you've mentioned the data reports and then you've even seen in your questions some pushback on particular countries and whatnot. And I'm just wondering about Freedom House in general and the reception of the reports, particularly if you think about, especially with the advocacy part of your organization, how these reports are received and whether or not your organization is the target then of, perhaps intimidation, cyberbullying. Like I could imagine a whole range of things that are cyber, but even what's worse, that you might not be welcomed with open arms in many of the countries that you're reporting on.
It's a great question, and I think about this a lot. First of all, I should be clear that the audience for our reports, we really want to be the policy community, aid agencies, Congress, academics. I mean, we kind of have an elite audience. I mean, we do, through the media, are fortunate to have considerable attention to the reports sometimes, depending on what they say, but we're really focused on really a policy audience. And so what you'll see for the next month or two after we put out Freedom of the World 2022 on Thursday is my team is going to fan out across the Hill. They're going to do briefings for lawmakers of both parties. They're going to go to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They'll probably go to USAID, the State Department, then other governments, want to hear about the report. So it's really, that's the audience that we want to focus on in the initial outreach. And I would say we get a lot of lobbying. The first week I was at Freedom House in 2017, I got a call from the Ukraine foreign minister who was upset about something in the report. I was like, what the hell is this? And so countries really pay attention to the report. I mean, it's funny, one of the students asked the question today, like if you're an unfree country, what's like China, they don't really care. But countries that are on the path, transitioning to a more openness, they care about what Freedom House says. Does that answer the question you were asking about?
Yeah, a lot of these countries act across their state boundaries as well, and perhaps wouldn't be too appreciative of it.
Well, I will say that I'm highly concerned about cyber attacks on Freedom House. There's no question, and we really, one of the things we've done in the last 4 or 5 years, really beefed up security. I've been personally sanctioned by the Chinese government, so that's kind of scary too. So when they retaliated against U.S. sanctions by naming 11 individuals to be the subject of Chinese sanctions, that was it was an interesting group of people. It was me, the head of Human Rights Watch, and the heads of some democracy organizations, and 6 Republican members of Congress like Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio. So that was like, it was kind of funny. So, and by the way, I mean, in some ways it's a badge of honor, but it's also a little scary.
Yeah, thanks. I see 2 more hands, and then I think we'll probably close after that. Shantae?
Good evening. So my question is, in the U.S., is it possible for democracy to be experienced equally? Or is that even the goal, right? So in a country that was built on a foundation of inequality that we still experience today, is it a slippery slope to compare ourselves to other countries in terms of our democracy when it's not potentially equally felt by those in the country? But maybe that's not the goal.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. What I would say is that one of the indicators we look at is equal treatment under the law. And that's an area where the U.S. hasn't fared as well compared to other countries in our reports. So that's how we look at that question.
How does the U.S. come out in general?
The U.S., okay, I'll just give you the raw numbers, just facts. So 11 years ago, our score was 94 out of 100. So that was really a very strong score. The Scandinavian countries tend to do the best, and then it's been historically some of the Western European countries and the United States. Over the last 11 years, there's been a substantial erosion. So now the US is 83 out of 100. And we're still a free country. We're still a strong democracy, but we are weaker than we were
What's the 100?
100 is like perfection in our
Oh, you
source.
mean out of one? Okay,
0 to
okay,
100.
got it. Okay, not of 100 countries.
Yeah, no, it's a scale of 0 to 100.
So an erosion. Got
Yep.
it. All right. Lisa.
Hi, thank you. So I've been thinking about Freedom House and where you are in the constellation of organizations now that are actually gathering data on democracy. And it occurs to me that you guys have something that I think is an answer to your question, which I think is the question, and that is you've been around longer, and you've had the same methodology that predates the moment that we're in. And I think that, that's an answer to Barbara's question. It's like, what is freedom? Well, this is what we've been saying for a long time. Here are the different ways it's measured. It's been continuous over time. I worry that a lot of the stuff that's coming out recently, all due respect to Brightline Watch, that
No, we like Brightline Watch.
and I do too. But it's coming out in a context that is already so polarized that it doesn't have the legitimacy that Freedom House has, because you guys have been around longer than anybody else. So I think that's really important and really valuable, and maybe something, maybe shifting your perspective to talk to ordinary people rather than to just the policy analysts.
Yeah, you're very kind to say that, and but I do think that you're right, that there are other reports, and they're all fine, but I do think that we have a certain amount of credibility by having basically used the same methodology for the last 50 years. Now, there's been some improvements, but basically, I think that's one of the strengths of Freedom House. And I also will say it's why it's important for Freedom House to be independent. The World Bank discontinued a certain index they were doing. I don't know the whole inside story, but that was a regrettable thing. And that's why, my number one goal is to continue to raise private money for Freedom House, so we do get government money too. We get a mixture of government, private, foundations, others, but I think it's important for us to remain independent so we can take that approach that you've done for the next 50, that you've enunciated for the next 50 years. So thank you for that question.
Well, Mike, you've laid out quite a picture for all of us. You've connected dots between what's happening here at home and internationally, and you've been honest about where we have good answers and where we don't. So it sounds like there's a bit of a role for universities, for young people, for folks who care about citizenship to play a role in this, and so we'll look forward to working with you on that. Dartmouth has a lot of resources that are committed to this already, and it's been a pleasure to host you. So please join me in thanking Mike Abramowitz for sharing some time and some thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Tori. It was great.